Glad to have you back. The Group Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, Mr. Bashir Ojulari, has announced that Nigerian pipelines and terminals crude oil receipts have reached nearly 100%. Mr. Ojulari made the disclosure at the African Chief of Defense Staff Conference in Abuja, crediting improved security interventions by Nigeria's military and intelligence agencies. He said crude theft and pipeline vandalism, once a major challenge in the Niger Delta, are now becoming issues of the past. My guest is Dr. Chinan Dikwal. He is a Vice Chair, African Energy Council. He's going to join me now to have this conversation to unpack all of this. Well, let's get to this. Dr. Dikwal, it's good to have you this afternoon. You're joining me from Qatar, right?
Absolutely, joining me from Doha. Pleasure to be here.
Doha, Qatar. Thank you so much. Well, I think we should start with sort of a good news there before we get into some other developments in the industry. Crude receipts now near 100%. I heard Mr. Tony Elumelu said also live to the president the last time that they are, getting up to 98% of production. What do you think? What should we ascribe this positive to? And what does it mean to us also with regards to revenue?
Yeah, so it's a very poignant one, and I think it's been a long, tortuous road to get here. What I'm describing here is, where we've been. A couple of things, with the attacks in the Niger Delta, militancy and all of that, and how it took us from 2.5 million barrels per day all the way to lows of approximately 1 million barrels per day, and then we've slowly been going up. When we started to come back up with production, Tolu, you'd know this, then we got into the problem of theft, crude oil theft. And that's where we were for a long time. In fact, the metric, Tolu, was that something like 250,000 barrels per day of crude in Nigeria was being stolen. This was when our production was only about 1.3 million barrels. So it was a huge number. Today, we can ascribe to your question, we can ascribe the success to the ability of government to plug those holes. And yes, it started about 3 years ago with Operation Delta Sanity, but I think that's been ramped up quite a lot over the last 2 years, and that's yielding results. I can confidently say, honestly, that the level of theft, what we can see from data today, is probably less than 5%. I say 5 to, but you can stretch and probably say about 7%, but certainly from the numbers we're seeing, I'll probably put it around 5% or less.
Brilliant stuff. So clearly, the need to use the security outfits, the locals and all of that. I think coming in of the locals and other security agencies is able to help sort this out. So that must be sustained. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing, right? So, Tolu, many times when we come up with policies and solutions and strategies, we don't always think about the nitty-gritty. The conventional thing is say, okay, get the Navy. The Navy goes out, and what the Navy is doing is policing those pipelines and all of that. The reality of it is many people don't pay a lot of attention to the social license to operate. What I mean by that is, what's the community context? Lots of the times we ignore that, and you can see that. The Navy were there for a long time. They couldn't curb the problem. Militancy actually increased at the time. Theft was rapid, in all that time. Today, we took some of those pipeline contracts and we put them in the community. If you look at the PIA, actually, just to put it out, if you look at the PIA, part of the PIA is tied to community engagement. If a pipeline gets sabotaged in the Niger Delta, there's a penalty that the community would pay because the community takes 3%. You know that 3% of overall capex that comes in for investment goes to the community based on the PIA. If that same community go and sabotage a pipeline, the repair cost of that pipeline is taken out of that 3%. So there's also another, social incentive for them to protect that. Of course, we know for a fact that there have been pipeline contracts that have gone to many leaders in that community. And I think that sort of symbiotic relationship where the community takes and then government also takes is always win-win. I'm not saying at all that's perfect, but certainly is the best that we have seen in a long time.
Well, we know of the $1.5 billion, we've talked about this many times, invested in Port Harcourt refineries, but we've seen news in recent times, EFCC investigations and all of that with regards to the management of all of those funds on that refinery. To me, that's not too much of a good news, and to the fact that that refinery is not even as productive as expected. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, so Tolu, I think this is where you get a different tone for me. I think that is a very it's very disappointing, a very humbling experience. I'd say a couple of things. One is, yes, in the last 2 days, we've heard the news coming out. Several ex-NNPC staff, contractors, and all of that are in EFCC net. Some money has been recovered. We saw an announcement of 5 billion naira that's been recovered. We've also seen an announcement of about $10 billion that's been taken in. I think also another $13 billion. So without a doubt, we are hearing, we're starting to see snippets of that coming in, right? We've also heard, I think from the announcement that a lot of those, and I think this is where it gets me interested, the very first instance of the work that's gone on, and I hear that the EFCC chairman has led this himself, which is highly commendable. But the very first part of the work has said that these are over-invoicing, contract inflation, and a couple of things. So these are just a low-hanging fruit, if you ask me. And even when I sit down, if I sit down and I forecast, I say, okay, 1.5 billion for Port Harcourt Refinery, 750 million for Kaduna Refinery, I think 600 million for Warri Refinery, altogether 2.9 billion, call it 3 billion, if you like. All of what's recovered in the context of 2 billion is less than 1%. The contract sum. All of what's recovered so far that we're hearing in the context of the 3 billion is less than 1%. I want to put that into context. So I do think that this is just the start of it. If we look deeper, there would be a lot that will come out. And I'm going to say this, Tolu, it's very easy to get hung up on $3 billion and say it's criminal. What is really criminal, if you ask me, is the fact that the money that was taken, that $3 billion did not come off the balance sheet of NNPC. The $3 billion did not come out of our foreign reserves. The $3 billion came out of a forward crude oil sale. What does that mean? I'll explain. Think about a yam farmer. A yam farmer plants his yam in January, and he's just planted the yam. We're in January right now. The yam farmer, instead of waiting to August when the yam will mature for him to sell, the yam farmer has just planted in January, and then he sells 50%. He calls somebody and says, you know what, I've just planted, but let me sell you 50% of what will mature in August. So he sells it up front, even before it's realized. So when he comes to August, there's bumper harvest, there's a lot of yam that's being harvested, but guess what? Half of that yam has already been sold, does not belong to him anymore. Half of that yam has already been sold. That is the situation in Nigeria. That's the problem with Nigeria. We've forward sold a lot of the crude oil. So even when we say 1.5 million barrels per day of crude that we're producing and we're happy about it, it's not really 1.5 million barrels to us. It's only approximately 1.1, probably about 1 million barrels of oil to us, because we sold currently about 500 million, maybe 450 of the crude we're producing has already been sold in forward crude oil sale. And for this refinery, we forward sold our crude, got that money to do turnaround maintenance here, and the whole thing has just been fraud, with all due respect. And if you ask me again, the other thing I'd say, Tolu, to think about this, honestly, the fraud is monumental.
Yeah.
But what I can get over here is this, that people would get the journalists to Port Harcourt Refinery and then set up a technical fraud, burning crude oil, showing us a flare that doesn't exist. They were literally just doing a gimmick and burning something to show journalists and to trick the whole nation. I think that's the next level up in terms of fraud. All of these things layered together, I think government need to look really deep into it. And I don't think we should accept 1% of contract value as the recoveries. The recoveries, in my opinion, should be way higher than that.
Indeed, allegations are here. And all of this brings me to the question, the fact that does that worry you with regards to trust, with regards to government fixing government machinery just like this refinery? Many will tell you, let private owners run it. If private guys run these refineries, we would have more. Look at what is happening with Dangote Refinery and other modular refineries operating across the country. Is it a statement of an issue of government has no business in business? Because NNPCL at that point was still operating like a government entity.
Well, I'll answer that question, but can I just say this quickly as well? So you're asking about trust in governance and whether they can run it.
Yeah.
Let me say this. Between 2005 and 2010, we had one of the biggest scandals in the Nigerian oil and gas sector. I just want to profile this. That was Halliburton and KBR. I think approximately around 579, 580 million dollars, scam that was perpetuated there that went to the U.S. courts. It was finalized. Between 2011, I think around 2014, we had another big fraud that was happening. OML 245. I think Bello Adoke wrote about that. His memoir, probably about 5 months ago, he wrote about that. That was I think OPL 245. That was Shell and ENI. $1.3 billion, believe it or not. Between that time, we had lots of subsidy scams as well over the period of time. I mean, several. We've had several. We've had Lamido Sanusi come out and say $20 billion was missing at the time. We've had a rift between Kachuku, I think Minister Kachuku, and Mekanti Baru, who was the head of NNPC at the time. $1.05 billion, I think, at the time. With Desiani, with all of. What I'm trying to say here is we're running an institution here that's being dogged by more controversy, fraud, and corruption than any value that's being returned. And then guess what? This institution is saying that it wants to go on IPO. Honestly, in my opinion, we need to clean our house before we go to IPO. If not, the valuation of this company would be so low and actually become a real farce and a problem for Nigeria as opposed to an asset.
That's a very strong one, but I think I really do agree. So do you, in 2 minutes, do you agree that private sector guys or private sector players who want to invest in this refineries could do better?
Without a doubt, I think, most of the things, when you take it off government hands, and we've seen this happen, you just gave the great example of Aliko Dangote. If you take it off government hands and pass it on to the private sector, we normally see that these things are run much, much better. But you know what? It's not always the case. Look at Nigeria LNG, partly government-owned, partly private-owned. It's doing spectacular. So I think the answer is not always a private sector, but without a doubt, I think I'd say this very quickly. We are seeing, Tolu, the biggest shift, I've said this before, in the Nigerian oil and gas sector that we have ever seen in a long time. In fact, just yesterday, I was so excited. The rig count, the numbers for rig count just came out yesterday. Rig count is the number of drilling rigs, active drilling rigs in the Niger Delta. Today, it stands at 46. It's one of the highest that we've ever had. Last year, it was 36, I think, on average, so it's gone up significantly. The year before, 2023, I think it stood at about probably 28. In fact, in 2021, we only had 8. So it's a massive trajectory. We're increasing, and a lot of that is driven because of the the PIA that's been passed, but also the executive orders that we're seeing. There's a huge incentive for people to come back into the Niger Delta where they've abandoned things before. People are coming back and investing capital, and I think that's very exciting.
Dr. Chinan Dikwal, it's a good way to leave it. Vice Chair, African Energy Council. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon from Doha. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.